Are you ready to board a roller coaster of true paranormal stories? Well, then strap in, because tonight I'm going to be sharing a series of spine-chilling eyewitness accounts sent in by viewers of this very show. You see, you might assume that the horrors I keep on telling you about live safely on the other side of your screen, but no. Frightening, unexplained events are happening out there too, amongst you. And as creepy as it has been, it's my privilege to bring some of those ghoulish cases into the light, though, fair warning, some of them might just crawl under your skin and stay there. I'm also thrilled to be joined in tonight's episode by two other fantastic paranormal channels, the Tape Library and Mystery Archives. Both will be joining me in presenting some of your encounters. But for now, I'm Peter Laws, and we begin with a terrifying experience from a viewer named Vicky. I call this one, Each Night a Little Closer. In the summer of 1981, Vicky Fuller was 15 years old, and her family moved in to the two-story home in Wetumka, Oklahoma, where tonight's experience happened. She'd been adopted as a young child by her Polish grandmother and third husband, a man Vicky loved very much. He was a preacher. Together, they had taken in Vicky and her older sister Patricia, raising them with care and stability after a difficult early life. There was such a positive influence on them that Vicky happily referred to them as Mum and Dad, and so that's how I will refer to them too. The new house was well over 100 years old, and it had charm, a big porch with a swing, elegant windows, and an unusual upstairs layout with a curious mix of oddly shaped rooms. Vicky's bedroom was in the top front corner of the house, a strange slanted space with a small round window that overlooked the street below. Now, this window was unlike any other she had encountered before. From inside the room, she could clearly see through this window, and often she would catch glimpses of people outside, only they seemed dressed in old-fashioned clothing. She even saw women pushing prams from another era, and yet whenever she went outside to look back at the house, she couldn't see the window. She could never get her head round this, but really that was only the beginning of the horror. Well, on that first night, only a mattress and a few belongings had arrived, and so Vicky and her sister Peggy were sharing the mattress in Vicky's room and were trying to get to sleep. Remember, Vicky was 15, but Peggy was older. In fact, she was going to move out in about 5 months to get married. Well, by now, Peggy was out for the count. She was a notoriously deep sleeper. Nothing ever woke her. But as Vicky closed her book and settled into the darkness to drift off, she heard it. A child's voice calling softly from outside the house. She sat up from the mattress, and to her shock, so did her sister, who could normally sleep through an earthquake. "Did you hear that?" Vicky asked, and Peggy said, "Yeah, I did." The voice came again, a little girl, and this girl was calling out a single name. "Emily, Emily." Vicky and Peggy were totally confused. What was the little kid doing out at this time of night? Is this what this new neighborhood was really going to be like? But they were nervous to go and check, and so they crouched and crawled towards the window, arguing nervously over who would be brave enough to stand up and look out. And finally, they counted down together. 3, 2, 1, and then peeked over the sill. And they saw her. There was a small girl standing outside in the night. Standing on the corner of their new property between a tree stump and a fire hydrant, and the little girl was clearly illuminated by a street lamp. She looked about 4 or 5 years old. She had long blonde hair, and it was very obvious that she was looking straight up towards their window. And the little girl called again, "Emily." Now, it's important to note at this stage that neither of the sisters felt that this was paranormal. The girl was so clear and so distinct that their first thought was that, oh, look, it's a local child looking for her friend, albeit at a shockingly late hour. It was about 1 a.m. at this point. But any sense that this girl was, quote, normal, quickly faded because suddenly, before their very eyes, the child by the street lamp seemed to just vanish. What seemed impossible had just happened. Yet they decided there wasn't much else they could do. They weren't about to go outside at that time of the night and investigate, and so they chose not to wake their parents either. The parents needed a good night's sleep after a tiring day of moving house, and so the sisters crawled back to the mattress on the floor, shaken and confused, and tried to sleep in this house that supposedly was theirs, but right now felt like it belonged to somebody else. The next day, everything seemed normal, but on the second night, the same thing happened again, and the third, too. It was the same time, each night, 1 a.m. They heard the little girl calling for Emily, they saw her staring up at the window, and they saw her vanish. Yet when it came to the fourth night, it all stopped. But just because the figure of the child did not appear anymore, that doesn't mean that Vicky felt settled in this house, because as the weeks passed and the family settled in, the sense of unease grew much, much worse. About 2 months later, Vicky was woken by a new sound. She sat up in bed when she heard it. There were heavy boots on the staircase. And these footsteps were halfway up the stairs. And then they climbed slowly to the top of the house where the bedrooms were. Now, on those first 3 nights, remember, she and her sister were sleeping in the same room, sharing a mattress. But the rest of their furniture came soon after that, and so now the girls were in their own bedrooms, in their own beds, which meant, of course, that Vicky was all alone when she heard those footsteps coming up the stairs. She held her breath as she heard the unseen intruder move down the hallway, past the bathroom, and straight to her parents' room. And then the steps stopped. There was a pause. And then the boots turned and walked to her sister's room, stopping again. Now, sometimes when people tell me their stories, I get surprised at how it's often the smallest of details that chill me. Well, when Vicky told me about this incident, she mentioned something. She said her parents kept their bedroom door closed, but they had a rule. They always made the girls keep their bedroom doors wide open, which meant that the thing from the staircase was now out there on the landing, standing at her sleeping sister's open door. It got worse, because Vicky heard the steps begin to move. This thing was entering Peggy's room. Vicky didn't know what to do. Should she call for help? Should she run out to the landing to check? Well, she didn't have long to decide, because then she heard the steps moving again, only this time they came out of her sister's bedroom, and they were now walking towards her open door. Terrified, she pulled the sheet over her head and breathed as shallowly as she could, trying not to make a sound. And she heard those steps in the darkness creaking along the floorboards, getting closer and closer, and she was hoping and praying that they would carry on past her open door. But they didn't. They stopped where she dreaded they would. Whatever was out there was right at the doorway, and it was waiting there. She heard the footsteps again, only now they were sharper and clearer. It was obvious to anyone listening that this visitor to their home was now coming into her bedroom. Vicky was so petrified by this undisputable presence that she couldn't bring herself to pull that sheet from her head this entire time, which meant she couldn't see a thing, but she could hear it, and it was approaching her bed now. She knew that it was getting horribly close, because she began to hear its breath, or should I say, his breath. Sounded like a man. His breath was coming closer and closer to her head under that sheet. Whoever it was out there was bending over the bed and leaning over her. Might she soon feel his fingertips pressing gently through the sheet into her hair? Or might he suddenly yank the sheet away and force her to look at something so terrifying it gnawed at the edges of reason itself? Vicky told me that this insanely scary moment lasted for 3 minutes. Yes, you heard that right, 3 minutes. But then, much to her relief, the leaning man turned and walked out of her bedroom. Not only that, she heard him descending the staircase before disappearing into silence. Now, I don't know about you, but having this one experience would be horrifying enough for me. But this walking presence returned every single night for the next 3 months. Always the same pattern, up the stairs, to the other rooms, into Peggy's room, and then into Vicky's room, where it would lean over her and breathe her in for 3 minutes, then leave. Now, I'm always conscious that when it's just one witness, and they are in bed at the time, there's always the chance that they could have been dreaming. So I asked Vicky if I could speak to her sister Peggy, and I did. I asked her, "Can you remember the footsteps on the stairs?" Peggy told me she could, and she remarked how scary those footsteps were. She also said that her dad would hear the steps too, and wake up at the sound of them. He was convinced it was Peggy trying to sneak out of the house. But when he looked into her door, Peggy was still in bed. When he looked into Vicky's room, she was in bed too. The steps were so clear that her dad searched every inch of the house, found nothing, no sign of intrusion. All the doors and windows were locked as expected. Peggy also told me that yes, the house was likable in many ways, and yet it had this very, well, how do I put it, a strangely unsafe atmosphere. Well, those footsteps started to become so regular that one night Vicky decided she had to see the figure. And so just after she heard it on the stairs, she plucked up the courage to sneak a look at it, creeping towards that open bedroom door with as much bravery as she could find. She leaned out and took a peek. There was a man on the staircase. Now, thankfully, his back was to her as he was climbing the stairs, and so Vicky was able to see what he was wearing. It was a long black coat. Now, Vicky described it to me as a duster. I didn't know what that meant, so I looked it up. Turns out it's something worn by horseback riders and early motorists. They would wear these long, lightweight coats to protect their clothes from the dust of travel. He was also wearing black boots, a white ruffled shirt, and a hat, a black top hat. Which is why, when sharing her story with me, Vicky referred to this presence, this person, as the top hat man. She even caught a glimpse of eyes that night as he turned. She said they almost had a glow about them. Now she'd seen him, she rushed to her bed and leapt in, assuming the normal position with her head under the covers and her heart in her mouth. Now, if you search the internet for stories of the Hat Man, you'll quickly find many other claims from people who say they've seen something just like this. Now, some viewers might dismiss this as some kind of modern paranormal internet myth, which is why it's particularly interesting to hear Vicky describing this figure back in 1981. That's long before the Hat Man became widely known in paranormal and pop culture circles. This man in the hat would enter her room every single night. He'd never speak. He wouldn't ever touch her, thankfully. But he'd look at her. She could feel that. He'd stare at her as she lay there shuddering beneath that sheet. The only way Vicky could get any sleep during this time was to always go to bed with the covers already over her head, forcing herself to breathe very shallowly in case her noise might entice him closer. The man came to her bed for 3 months. She was so scared that even after it stopped, Vicky kept up this sleep routine under the covers, breathing low, for about a year. Vicky said that this habit of sleeping with such little air for 12 months makes her wonder sometimes if this could have contributed to her adult sleep apnea, which she struggles with even today. That's a sleep disorder where a person stops breathing for short periods while asleep, often without realizing it. It can lead to poor sleep quality, exhaustion, and potential health issues. Well, I looked into this, and while it seems unlikely that a year of sleeping under cover while shallow breathing would directly cause sleep apnea, there may be some connection. You see, as she told me her account, I could really sense the psychological impact this experience had on her. Something so scary that it may well have caused her to develop long-term sleep anxiety. This prolonged experience could have triggered what's called a conditioned response. That is where the brain begins to associate sleep with constant vigilance and breath control. It doesn't directly cause sleep apnea, but it's possible it might aggravate and compound sleep-related issues. Whatever the case, the idea that this affected Vicky so deeply that she still feels haunted by it even as she sleeps almost 50 years later is chilling and poignant. But even though the top hat man thankfully stopped coming into her room, the house wasn't done with them, because weird things started happening elsewhere on the property. Vicky's mother kept a ceramic dish shaped like a fish by the kitchen sink. Before doing the dishes, she'd remove her rings and watch and place them into the bowl. Sometimes when she turned back, even for just a minute, she would look back again and the jewelry would be completely gone. This happened frequently. Now, at first, her mother always blamed the girls for this until their father pointed out that that was impossible because this would sometimes happen while the kids were out, while Vicky was at school. Not only that, even when they were home, the rings and watch would vanish from the dish and then be found later upstairs neatly laid out. So even when they were home, the kids simply couldn't have done this, all in the space of 60 seconds, not without being seen. And then there was the knife. Yes, Vicky's father had a favorite knife. He used it to cut up whole chickens. One afternoon, he set the cutting board down on the counter and he placed the knife beside it. And then he went to the fridge to grab the chicken. When he turned back, the knife was completely gone. But just seconds later, he spotted the handle of the knife from the corner of his eye. It was barely visible at the very top of a ceiling-height cupboard. Now, this cupboard required a 12-foot ladder from the shed to reach the top, and yet the knife had somehow left that space and wound up at the top of that. This thing with the knife happened more than once. In fact, Vicky remembers witnessing it happen. Eventually, her dad got wise to this, and he would put the chicken out and then get the knife. For some reason, when it was done in this order, the knife stayed where it was supposed to. Now, remember I said that Vicky's dad, her adopted grandfather, was a preacher. Vicky told me that at the time she didn't realize this, but because of his faith, he didn't feel very comfortable talking about topics like spirits and ghosts. And so even though these things were happening in the home, it wasn't like they were all talking openly about it. All of this activity, the footsteps, the top hat man, the impossibly moving objects, well, it became too much for this family. They hoped this would be their forever home. But Vicky said that they all became scared. They ended up selling the house after just a year of living there. This is interesting. They sold it to a widowed man with some kids. But after just a few months, he too handed the keys back and walked away. A lawyer from Oklahoma City bought it next, planning to retire there. But after renovating the home, he also sold it on. Even Vicky's former science teacher, an open skeptic of the paranormal, owned it briefly before they also passed it on too. The house changed hands so often that it was eventually turned into a rental property, and it carried on being passed from tenant to tenant like something nobody wanted to hold on to for long. Vicky spoke to one family who lived there after they had. Another preacher's family, interestingly. What she heard from them chilled her. That family experienced the same things. The footsteps, the man in the hat, and even the little girl calling from outside. But they stayed much longer. What was the secret to their endurance? How did they manage it? Well, according to them, the children of that family spent most nights sleeping at friends' houses, and the parents were rarely home. They did that because the activity in the house was too intense that the parents were very happy for the kids to have near constant sleepovers. You know, some houses welcome you, but this one, well, this one, it appears, simply waits for you to leave, as Vicky discovered in that summer of 1981. Vicky Fuller was terrorized by an apparently supernatural intruder in her bedroom, but at least she didn't have to look directly into its face. Which is more than can be said for our next case. A viewer called Kyle got in touch with me, and he has requested that I withhold his surname, which I will. He had an experience that, much like Vicky, has left him shaken for decades, but this entity was particularly freakish. And for this true viewer story, I'm going to hand over to the brilliant YouTube channel, The Tape Library. Prepare yourself for an encounter with the Smiler in the closet.
Kyle had always been a skeptic. A lifelong member of the church, he was a man of study and faith. But in his early 20s, during a difficult period of self-reflection, he found himself drawn to the paranormal, but from a place of doubt. A need to know if there was truly something beyond human perception. His fascination led him to the Knox County Poorhouse. Rising from the hamlet of Bangs, Ohio, the Poorhouse was once the largest building in the state, a towering Victorian Gothic monolith that loomed over the landscape. Built in the 19th century, its purpose was grim. It was the last refuge for the destitute, the sick, and the unwanted. Over the decades, it changed hands many times. An infirmary, a Bible college, then a decaying relic of neglect. The old place was filled with scattered medical equipment and abandoned hospital beds. At one point, it was even converted into a commercial haunted house. It certainly looked the part, before being condemned and left to rot. Then in 2006, a partial collapse sealed its fate. But those who dared trespass spoke of a suffocating unease, and of things that moved in the dark. Carl hadn't believed that, not at first, but he accepted an invitation to visit the place, even though it meant a 3-hour drive. It was a grey afternoon in 2006 when he and his friend arrived. The building loomed like a horror film set, almost cliché with its boarded up windows and scarred walls. His friend, a local, had visited before during its haunted attraction days, but now she seemed uneasy. Carl urged her to come with him. They had a few hours of daylight left and police only patrolled after dark, but she refused, visibly disturbed. This was already too much, so she turned and walked back to the car. Kyle shrugged and slipped through the broken rear entrance, alone. Despite the daylight, the interior was almost pitch black. Every window boarded, sealing the building in thick shadow. Kyle clicked on his flashlight, its beam catching swirls of dust in the stale air. Graffiti covered the walls. Halloween props from the building's haunted house days littered the space. Plastic limbs, fake blood. At first glance, it was more tacky than terrifying. Much of the first floor was inaccessible due to the collapse, where parts of the upper level had caved in. But Kyle found an intact stairwell and made his way up. The longer he explored, the more at ease he felt. Until he reached the attic, which was filled with old school desks. Despite the creeping unease, he forced a smirk. As a playful gesture, he chewed a stick of gum and pressed it into the attic window ledge, his own mark of defiance. He had explored the Poorhouse and survived. Or so he thought. He headed back outside when he realised he'd been inside for 2 hours. His friend was annoyed but intrigued. He told her about the creepy interior, the desks in the attic, but insisted it didn't feel haunted. "What about the basement?" she asked. His eyebrows shot up. "What basement?" She hesitated, like she'd rather not tell him, but he said it again. "What basement?" "I'll show you, but only for a second." Back inside, she led him near the stairwell and pointed to a square cut in the wooden floor, about 3 feet wide. "That's it," she said. "The basement." Carl checked his watch. It was getting late, but who was he kidding? "I'm going down," he said. As soon as his feet touched the floor, the air changed. Something about this space felt wrong, oppressive, and it wasn't just the dark. Kyle said that the fear that had eluded him upstairs swept in suddenly and fully. The space itself was claustrophobic, more crawl space than basement, narrow, low, with just enough height to crouch and move. When he shared his experience with Peter, he made this disturbing comment. "It felt as if I had walked into a room where there was a group of people who hated me with a visceral hatred.
like they had rushed me and put their face on mine.
His flashlight beam revealed nothing. No figures, no faces. But the feeling was shocking and wouldn't leave him. He turned a corner beneath the collapsed section, only to find the passage blocked by debris. Then it hit him. He had to get out. He said,
I quickly, without thinking, turned and sprint-crawled, if that's a word, back to the stairwell. My anxiety and fear were clawing at my back. I pulled myself up from the darkness, terrified that something was about to grab my feet.
Outside, gasping for air, he turned to his friend. I was wrong, Kyle said. There really is something evil in there, and it's in the basement. They got in the car and sped away. You might think that was the end of it, only Kyle would come to believe that whatever was in the basement hadn't stayed behind. That night, Kyle returned home. His father was away, so it was just his mother and brothers. After a quick chat, he went to bed. At some point in the night, he awoke to the creak of his bedroom door opening. Then his lights flickered on. Something was standing in the doorway. As God is my witness, he said.
I swear I saw this thing, and this thing was freakish. It wore a red hood, but its face was clearly visible. Gaunt, ashen grey. The skin stretched tight, and get this, its eye sockets sagged downwards, as if being pulled, like when children drag their cheeks down to make a scary face, to stretch their eyes. Only, this thing had no eyes.
Even so, he felt like it was staring directly at him. Its fingers were long and twisted. They hung at its sides in a grotesque, lifeless way. But worst of all was its smile. It grinned as it entered the room. The face, that smile, it burned itself into Kyle's memory. Years later, through his studying years, a master's degree in biblical theology, as well as a master's in divinity, and through his years pastoring churches, he could still see that face when he closes his eyes. He can still see today. The figure shuffled slowly across the room, always staring at him. Kyle pushed himself back against the headboard as hard as he could. Then it reached out for the closet door and turned towards it. It rattled the handle, and just before it stepped inside, it turned and smiled again, then stepped inside. The closet door clicked shut behind it. Kyle lay there frozen. His skin crawled. He wanted to scream, to call out, but couldn't. He prayed silently. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him into a restless sleep. The next day at school, he tried to tell himself it had been a lucid nightmare, but that theory collapsed when he got home. His mother stopped him in the hallway. "What were you doing in your closet last night?" she asked. His blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She told him she heard the closet door open in the night. Then she heard voices, talking, from his room. He couldn't remember talking to this thing, but she said just that. She heard the closet door open, with voices in the room, and then the door clicked shut. She asked him again, "What were you doing in your closet last night?" Kyle never saw the figure again, at least not physically. But for years he felt it. Shadows in the corners of his vision. Unseen footsteps in the night. Closets in bedrooms and hotel rooms. And the wonder if something was in there, still watching. Whatever had been in the basement of the Knox County Poorhouse, could it really have followed him home?
Our first two stories unfolded on American soil. But the strange and the supernatural are not bound by borders. And so now we cross the Atlantic, where the quiet halls of a centuries-old English mansion hold a chilling secret. The next encounter takes us to the UK. It's time to meet the Watcher in the West Wing. Stuart Green trained as an archaeologist, a man of science with a healthy skepticism about the paranormal. But he got in touch with me to share two strange occurrences in his life. The first of which took place at Christchurch Mansion. This Tudor brick mansion in Ipswich, England, has stood for over 500 years. Now, it used to be a priory, and then later it was made into a stately home, but it's been a museum since 1885. And yes, it's reported to be haunted. There have been sightings of a young woman in Edwardian dress, dancing and laughing with two children in the upstairs art gallery. She always seems happy and content to whirl around those halls. But the eyewitness account Stuart shared with me was rather less fun and friendly. Stuart joined the museum staff in 2015. He worked there as a duty officer for the next 8 years, and during that time he began hearing stories of strange and eerie activity within the mansion's walls. One such story came from an older member of the night security team, a man who had worked there for 15 years before Stuart had arrived. On one occasion, in the deep, dark hours of a night shift, that man returned from his patrol and settled in the staff room. There was a cozy space tucked into the west wing, the old servants' quarters. The rest of the mansion lay silent. It was around 2 a.m. when he kicked back in his chair and he opened up a large broadsheet newspaper, resting his feet on a nearby footstool. It's around then that he heard it. A tapping sound, like something rapping on the ancient stone flags that run through that mansion like a spine. Slabs so old they might date back to the original priory from the 1540s. But the taps became footsteps. Soft and feminine, he thought, and growing closer. He left the staff room door open. Whatever was walking towards him could step right inside. His breath started to quicken as the steps grew closer, and something about the sound, the sense of presence, convinced him that this was not normal. And he was so, frankly, scared and oppressed by this feeling that he lifted the newspaper higher and held it in front of him like a shield, very much like Vicky did with her bedsheet. Silly perhaps, you might think, but I get this. When I had a frightening experience in a haunted New England mansion, you can check out that story here, I lay in bed with my eyes clamped shut. It was just too scary to even think about opening them. So this man did the same, holding his paper high as the footsteps grew louder, until he knew beyond doubt that whoever was making that sound had now entered the staff room. Still clutching the paper, he waited, and then came the push. Something jabbed at his foot. I don't mean soft like a hand, I mean something hard, like someone was holding the end of a cane or a walking stick and shoving his feet off the stool. And then a voice. A woman's voice, cold and stern, authoritative. And she said,
"Who do you think you are?"
He dropped the paper and saw the staff room was completely empty. Utterly shaken, he grabbed his radio and immediately called security control, demanding to be replaced. He wasn't staying here tonight. But before leaving, perhaps for the sake of sanity, he and the replacement guard swept the entire building, checking for intruders. They found nothing. Within a month, that man had transferred to the day shift, and he never worked another night in Christchurch Mansion again. Now remember I said that the staff room was in the West Wing. Well, Stuart, the man who shared this story with me, said he always felt a difference in the atmosphere of the West Wing, especially upstairs. For example, on one afternoon, Stuart and a colleague were up there when they heard footsteps in the attic above them. And Stuart acknowledged that yes, old timber can creak, but this was different. He told me that they were, beyond any doubt, footsteps. Now, access to the attic was strictly limited to staff, and all staff were required to sign in when entering the building. They checked. No one was upstairs. Stuart said he often felt uneasy in that part of the house, and it felt to him as if he was intruding on someone else's personal space. Was it just a feeling he was getting? Was he being impressionable? Well, here's the strange thing. Hundreds of visitors to the museum told him the same thing. As a duty officer, he had to manage the front of house team, maintain the exhibits, look after the people on site. He was interacting with multiple people throughout the day, and he told me that hundreds of people would say to him things like, "I love this house. It's so welcome and warm. But man, that west wing, something is not right over there." One American couple even refused to enter that section of the house completely. And when Stuart asked them why, they told him they were psychic. They said the space didn't feel evil or dark, but it did feel intensely private, like something was there, and they said, as if it didn't want company. The exact same impression that Stuart had had. Well, what's interesting about Stuart was that this was not his first encounter with the paranormal. That came on an unforgettable family trip in Scotland. And for that, we hand over to the Mystery Archives, who will show us the eyes in the ruins.
Years earlier, in around 2005 or 2006, Stuart had visited Scotland with his family. He was about 14 years old at the time. They'd spent the day in the city of Edinburgh, seeing the castle, climbing Arthur's Seat, and walking the streets. Quite the clan, really. Stuart, his mother, her then partner, and his 4 siblings, 7 of them in total. They'd had a wonderful day, but eventually decided that it was time to head back to where they were staying, a caravan site. It was still the afternoon, and as they made their way back, Stuart's mom suddenly turned the car down a narrow country lane, saying to the family, "Just one more place to see." Stuart looked out the window as the lane slid by, and soon saw the place they were about to pay a visit to, Seton Collegiate Church. This church is old, mostly built in the 15th to 16th centuries. It was constructed on the site of an earlier church dating back to the 13th century. In 1492, Lord Seton founded a college of 6 priests to live in his church, specifically to pray for the souls of the Seton family, who lived in a vast mansion nearby. Imagine being so wealthy that you could hire your own personal clergy, whose job it is to pray for you. Stuart's mom drove them down a long lane lined with trees until they pulled up to a gate, which was locked. But the man responsible for the place, the caretaker, was actually right there. He had only just locked up. "I know you're shutting down for the day," she said, "but is there any chance that we could have a quick look?" He smiled back. "Of course," he said, and opened the gate again. Stuart remembers him as kind and friendly. They stepped inside and looked around the ruins, and frankly, the place looked beautiful. It all felt wonderfully peaceful. The caretaker led them into the central main part of the building, where in years gone by, the congregation would sit or stand for services. But something felt strange. It was filled with chairs. The caretaker confirmed that there was to be a wedding held there in just a few days. At that point, he left them, saying he had a few more doors to lock up, and that he'd meet them again at the front gate. And so, the whole family suddenly found themselves alone in Seton Church. They didn't stay long. They knew they weren't really supposed to be there. But Stuart had just enough time to sign the visitor's book and take in the atmosphere. Then his mom called out for him. It was time to go. He ran down the nave to catch up with them as they walked out. But just as he was about to pass through the church doors, he felt a strange compulsion to stop, to turn back and look at the church one last time. And that's when he saw it, a figure. It was standing in the area where the chairs had been set out for the wedding, half peeking out from behind the door so he could only see part of it. But he told me, I could see it as clear as anything else I'd seen that day. A long brown, almost black cassock with a hood covering its face, and it was looking at him, right at him. If you asked Stuart to describe what it was, that as cliche as it might sound, it looked like a monk. And the two of them just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Now, if I'd seen this, I'd have been backing away in fright, but Stuart said he didn't feel scared. The atmosphere of the church, bathed in the warm golden hour light, still felt peaceful. This monk, he said, felt like a part of that peace. He didn't sense anger, just curiosity. He said that it was as if this figure had noticed the large family disrupting the stillness of its home and was curious to watch them go, maybe even eager to see them leave. Then, the figure moved. It ducked into the area with the chairs, and as soon as it was gone, Stuart immediately shouted for his brothers. They came running back, wondering what the fuss was. They rushed into the nave and started to sweep the place, looking for whatever Stuart had seen. They found no one, and importantly, nowhere anyone could have hidden. They checked for a curtain or cloth. Perhaps the wind had lifted it and created an illusion of a hooded figure, but there was nothing like that. Stuart looked at his brothers and told them, "I swear I just looked into the eyes of a ghost." His parents came to hear what had happened, but they really did have to leave. As they hurried down the lane, Stuart said he could feel the fear growing. Not because the figure had threatened him. He didn't believe that it meant harm, but because the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. He had locked eyes with a man who might have been long dead. As they reached the gate, they thanked the caretaker, and Stuart couldn't help himself. He asked the man, "Has anyone ever spoken of ghosts in this church?" The caretaker just smiled and said, "There's nothing here but peace, whatever it may look like." His mom thanked him and they left. 20 years have passed since that day, but Stuart has never forgotten what the caretaker said or what he saw in the golden haze of an ancient church, a ruin that, it appears, simply refuses to forget.
And so we move to our final case that comes from an online friend of mine called Cameron Cheney. And this one may be the most unsettling of them all. A story of blood, terror, and children, and a name that refuses to be forgotten. Let me tell you about the time when Jenna came home. Cameron Cheney is an author. We've been friends online for years now. He's a novelist, but something happened to his family and his sister in particular that was not fiction. So I wanted to tell you about it because it is seriously creepy. Now, before I start, it's true that Cameron writes horror novels, and so some out there may assume that this is just a made-up tale as one of his spooky stories. So to fact-check his claims, I was able to speak to the sister in the story who is the core of this, and she confirmed that what Cameron told me really did happen. And she gave me some extra details too. In fact, their entire family were there to witness this. And the frightening events happened back in his family home in 2003. He was 10 years old at the time and part of a pretty big family. First, there was his mom and stepdad, then Taylor, who was 6, Sophia, who was 2, and the youngest, Mason, who was a newborn at the time. Cameron had grown up in this house, and it always felt like a safe haven to him, until something happened that turned it, as he puts it, into a place of fear. The shift from haven to horror didn't begin in the house itself, but at a rather unexpected location. A dance studio in town. You see, the family had one other sibling, Hannah. She was in her 20s and had already moved out of the house. She worked as a dance instructor at the studio. His sister, Taylor, saw her big sisters dancing and just wanted to be like her. And since she was 6 years old, she was able to enroll in ballet lessons. Cameron has vivid memories of sitting with his mum and younger siblings, killing time in the waiting room and waiting for Taylor to finish. I used to take my daughter to ballet lessons, so I know that feeling. But then something happened in the waiting room one night that would shift his family's life in a shocking new direction. They, along with a bunch of other parents, were in the waiting room waiting for the class to finish when his 2-year-old sister, Sophia, the one I spoke to, started to suddenly act up. She seemed to erupt in a fury. He said she was, quote, throwing the biggest tantrum any of us had ever seen. She was picking up toys and throwing them on the ground and filling the space with the types of screams and cries that made the other parents wince and made Sophia's mum wince even more. What was Sophia unhappy about? Well, it was simple. Her 2 older sisters, Taylor and Hannah, were dancing somewhere in the studio right now, and Sophia didn't think that was fair. She too wanted to learn. In fact, she was already demonstrating a very natural ability to dance even at that early age. So she started calling out, "I want to dance too! Let me! And she was screaming the place down. Her mum tried to explain that you had to be at least 5 years old to enroll in a class here, but this only sent Sophia into a bigger rage. Well, Sophia's tantrum kept going and going until something really odd happened. Almost in an instant, Sophia stopped screaming, and she suddenly turned not only calm, but happy. Cameron said the mood shift was so quick, it was like, quote, the flip of a coin. Now at this point, she'd sat next to a basket of toys that were on the waiting room floor. She was sitting there suddenly laughing and having fun. And as weird as the change was, Cameron and his mum were just thankful that all the noise had stopped. And then when the ballet class had finally come to an end, they piled into the family van. Cameron says that Sophia giggled the entire drive home. That giggling didn't stop. When Cameron came home from school the next day, he heard that same chuckling echoing through the house. It was coming from Sophia in her room. Cameron followed the laughter down the hall, curious to see what was entertaining her so much. And when he got there, he found his mum standing in Sophia's doorway. She was watching her daughter playing with her Barbie dolls on the floor. When Cameron came closer, his mum turned and said, Sophia has an imaginary friend now. And they've been playing like this all day. She's called Jenna. Now, for a young child to have an imaginary friend is not unusual at all. They're very common and can be perfectly healthy. I had one myself. And yet when I covered the topic of imaginary friends in another video, I shared some startling and really quite frightening cases where the imaginary friend, or the Invisikid as they are sometimes known, was not very friendly or healthy at all. You'll find that video here. Well, Cameron leaned into the doorway to see Sophia on the floor playing with a child who wasn't there, talking to what seemed like thin air, and let's just say it thoroughly creeped him out, and he wanted nothing to do with it, especially when her room was directly across the hall from his. Sophia's friendship with the unseen girl carried on for weeks after that. Sophia would be excited to talk about her new friend, Jenna. She'd describe her too, saying how nice Jenna was, how pretty she was, with her dark brown, almost black hair, and her dancing costume, which was a light lavender colour. Sophia never seemed to shut up about her best friend, frankly, and the rest of the family tried to brush off Sophia's constant chatter until something happened that meant they couldn't brush it off any longer. One night, as the family slept, the silence of the house was shattered by a terrible scream. It was Sophia. Every member of the family heard it. Now, if you've got a family or sisters or siblings, if you've ever slept in a house with a 2-year-old, let's say, you know that sometimes they wake up from bad dreams crying in the night. And if you're a sibling, you kind of just pull the pillow over your head and leave it for your parents to sort out. And yet there was something about this, a level of terror in Sophia's scream that was so shocking that every single member of the family leapt out of bed and went rushing to her room to see if she was okay. They flung the door open, rushed inside, and what they saw just took them aback. Sophia was in the bed with her eyes clamped tightly shut, and she was thrashing around in the bed, wailing and screaming. But it was what she was saying amongst the screams that made the family so uneasy. Sophia was begging, pleading for this new friend of hers, Jenna, to leave her alone. If Jenna was invisible, it almost looked like she was grabbing or pulling at Sophia, crawling onto her. Maybe Jenna's face was close to Sophia's face because Sophia's eyes were shut so incredibly tight. Cameron's mum and stepdad rushed to the bed and tried to calm her down. Cameron said it took them 10 whole minutes just to get Sophia to open her eyes again. Think about that, 10 minutes. That's how scared she was. But eventually she did open those eyes. Cameron said he got a shock. He'd never seen his little sister show complete terror, but that is what he was looking at in her eyes that night. They'd all been firing questions at her. What's wrong? What's wrong? Now she'd finally calmed down. Sophia started to answer them. She said Jenna had been in her room, but she said that Jenna looked different tonight. They asked her, what do you mean? She said there was something wrong with Jenna's head. Sophia described it as broken, and that her new friend was now drenched in blood. The rest of the family looked at each other. This was creepy. Now Sophia, still trembling, then told them that Jenna had been desperately upset, saying that the blood-covered child kept complaining about how much her broken head hurt her, but also that she was frantically looking for her mummy and daddy but couldn't find them. What was this? A dream? Some sort of night terror? Well, of course, it must be. But that didn't stop Cameron flicking his eyes around the room, nervous about what he might see crouching in the shadowed corners. But other than Sophia, there was no other little girl in that room. Of course there wasn't, blood-soaked or otherwise. Well, eventually they managed to get Sophia back to sleep. But everyone seemed on edge as they headed back to their beds, not least Cameron, across the hallway, and he admitted that he was so freaked out by this that he left his bedroom lights on for the rest of the night. Well, the family may have hoped this was simply a one-off night terror, but it was not. You see, on some nights, Sophia would sleep soundly, but on others, she would erupt in those same screams again, saying that Jenna wasn't only back in her bedroom, but that Jenna was being mean and scary and threatening. So, okay, then I guess Sophia must be having recurring nightmares. That can happen too, right? Well, yes, it can, of course. But this is when the events turned far more worrying and physical. Sophia began waking up with bite marks on her body. It was shocking to see. Sophia was coming out of her room in the mornings with clearly visible teeth marks on her arm. And these bites were so deep that blood was seeping out of them. Now, Sophia insisted that she had not done this to herself. It was Jenna, she said. It was Jenna. Jenna, who had been so friendly and pretty and normal before, had now turned into a terrifying, blood-covered, violent and manic bully who was climbing on Sophia in the night so she could bite her and cause her pain. It's worth slowing down just to process that image for a second. How horrifying that would be for a 2-year-old to be relentlessly targeted like that. Up till now, Cameron's parents were concerned about Sophia for sure, but they just figured it was something in her head. But this was becoming far more serious. And things only got worse when the activity in the rest of the house began. The next morning, the mum and stepdad were sitting on the couch, and they were in deep debate, trying to figure out just what on earth could be happening in Sophia's bedroom each night. For a start, they were wondering how, at her age, could she possibly be talking about such horrific topics, like a little girl with a head cracked open pouring blood. At 2 years old, it's not like Sophia had ever seen anything like that on TV or in the books. They weren't letting her watch that sort of stuff. She also hadn't started school yet, so it wasn't like she was getting told scary stories from the older kids. Where was she getting this stuff from? But the worst part were, of course, the wounds on her arm. This had become dangerous. Even if there wasn't something paranormal going on, the thought of your 2-year-old sitting in bed, gnawing on her own forearm deep enough to draw blood, well, that is a horrendous thought for any family to cope with. They wondered if, well, Sophia must have some sort of condition that was causing her to see things, but even to cause harm to herself. This would be a terrible blow to a family, of course, but at least there would be some kind of logic to it. But as they were discussing all of this, something happened in the room that shifted this all from worrying to all-out chilling. Because whatever innocence had been left in the situation was about to vanish. Remember I said the youngest member of the family was Mason. He was a newborn at the time. Well, they had baby toys for Mason, scattered on the floor near the couch. And as the adults sat there discussing Sophia, one of these toys suddenly started to move. It began to spin on the floor. And then its lights began to flash and music came out of its tinny little speakers. But hear me now, I've got kids. When they were young, we had toys all over the place. I do not just mean that the toy went off because a timer went off, a motion sensor or something like that. I mean, the toy began moving as if someone was literally sat there playing with it. They both stared at each other with fear, bewilderment. And as the toy rolled around on its own, Cameron's mum tried something. She spoke towards the toy and said 2 simple words. "Hi, Jenna." As soon as that name, Jenna, was floating in the air of the room, the toy immediately stopped moving, as if whoever was playing with it had paused to turn and look towards the grown-ups on the couch. And in that moment, the room filled with the dread of a suffocating, invisible pressure. Because where was Jenna now? Well, as I mentioned, his older sister Hannah, the dance instructor, didn't live at home. And so she came to visit the family on the night after the toy had moved around. Well, of course, it didn't take long for them all to start talking and telling Hannah about what had been going on with Sophia. And Hannah was obviously disturbed, of course. This was her little sister going through some sort of trauma. But the moment that caused the colour to drain from Hannah's face was when the parents described this imaginary friend. They told Hannah that this girl had very dark hair and that she wore a lavender dance suit, which got Hannah's attention. But it was when they mentioned the name Jenna that Hannah's face lost its light, like someone had blown out a candle behind her eyes. "What's wrong?" they asked her. Hannah sat there trying to get her breath back, and then Hannah told them this. A few years ago, there was a little girl who took classes at the dance studio where Hannah worked. This little girl wore a lavender dance suit and had dark hair. She came to have lessons at the studio for a very long time, until one day when she didn't turn up. Then Hannah was informed of the terrible news. That little girl and her parents had all been killed in a tragic house fire. And the little girl's name was Jenna. I simply cannot imagine what it must have been like for Cameron's family to hear that, and then to have to go to sleep that night with the knowledge that there may be the deeply troubled presence of a dead child walking the hallways of their home, playing with the toys. A child that now had a cruel and violent fixation on Sophia. Well, the next day, they all decided to try something, and it sounded crazy, but they couldn't really think of what else to do. The whole family walked every inch of the house, stepping into every room, every staircase, and as they went, they spoke out loud, saying things like this. "Jenna, if you're here, it's time that you moved on. Jenna, this isn't the place for you. Jenna, go and meet your parents, okay? They're waiting for you in heaven. That's where you belong." Was this an exorcism? No, not really. It's just an attempt to help a poor little girl on her way and to get Sophia out of harm's reach. They had no idea if it would work. But as the days and weeks went by after that walk through the house, they started to realize that it had. Ever since Sophia had returned from the dance studio on the night of that tantrum, the atmosphere in the home had felt heavy and oppressive. But now the family actively felt the air lifting. Something seemed lighter. Cameron even began to feel safe in his bed again. And yes, he started to sleep with the light off, eventually. Jenna never came back. And the bite marks, the screams, the ghostly toy on the floor, it all stopped. But even now, all these years later, the family can't shake the feeling that something followed Sophia home that night from a dance studio where another little girl had longed to dance too. A girl who had no one left, except perhaps a new friend to cling to. Now, when I connected with Cameron about this, I thought that was the end of the story, but as I mentioned, I also got in touch with Sophia herself to ask her to confirm if these events were true. She said they were. But I also asked her if she ever worried if Jenna would appear again. She said no, she didn't. She didn't feel that Jenna would ever return to her. What particularly haunted Sophia, though, was why? Why did Jenna take a particular attraction to Sophia, considering all the other kids that went through that dance studio? Especially when Sophia was in the midst of a huge tantrum when that happened. Ironically, that made me wonder if Jenna related to Sophia's sense of panic and frustration at not being allowed to dance, just as Jenna was panicked and angry that she didn't seem allowed to find her parents. But then Sophia told me something fascinating. She said that sometimes she still wonders if that really was the spirit of a little girl after all, or could she have encountered some kind of darker figure pretending to be a little girl. Now, why would she suggest that? Well, she told me that later in her life she has had terrifying experiences while lying in bed. Things that felt different from dreams, more like out-of-body experiences. For example, on New Year's Eve 2018, Sophia had just gone to bed when suddenly she could see herself sleeping, like she was watching herself from across the room. And above her head, she saw a small, winged creature speaking over her sleeping body. She heard the words, but they sounded like they were another language that she couldn't place. She described it as something like a gargoyle. And there was an unsettling detail that she had. In between it speaking over her, it would giggle. Just like she had giggled with Jenna all those years before. Then, in the following year, 2019, she had a small studio apartment. It had a kitchen at one end, and it had her bed at the other end. She woke one night wondering if she might be having some sort of sleep paralysis episode. But then she quickly realized this was different because she was able to sit up, and she was very aware of having been asleep but now being awake. Only what started happening around her was frightening. You see, she looked down at her hands, and she could see them changing shape. And she could even start to control the lengths of her fingers and the color and shape of her palms. It was absolutely crazy. And when she looked across the room and saw the kitchen, she noticed that in the kitchen was standing a tall, shadowy figure. This entity was so tall that its head was nearly touching the ceiling. Now, thankfully, it wasn't looking in her direction, but then that changed, because the head of this thing turned and caught her gaze. Now, she said it had no facial features or eyes, but she could tell it was staring at her, which is fascinating. It's exactly the same as what Kyle told us when he saw that eyeless smiler looking at him. But at least when it happened to Kyle, the thing turned and went into a closet. For Sophia, however, the figure locked its gaze on her, and then it rushed at her, swooping across the studio apartment until her vision was blocked with blackness. It was like this thing was on her. And when she said that, I couldn't help but think of what she'd said as a child when she was thrashing around asking for Jenna to leave her alone. Like her imaginary friend had been crawling on her and biting her back then. And another intriguing detail. Sophia said she got the sensation from this thing that she shouldn't be there. That she was unwelcome in that space, in her own studio apartment. Very similar to what Stuart talked about in the mansion. As if we humans might think we belong in certain places, even our own homes. Well, there may be others who strongly disagree. Well, eventually the dark shape vanished and she was left on the bed, gasping for air. And these were just some of the weird and shocking experiences that Sophia had later in life. As I spoke to her about these things, I could tell that moments like these seemed to blur the lines between nightmare and reality. But after what happened with Jenna and her family, it makes her wonder. Makes me wonder. Are these things connected? And what might they want? It makes me think of something else too. Are there things out there that can come and find you, watch you, climb onto you, sink their teeth into you, not just to hurt you, but to remind you that you don't belong here. Not in this mansion, not in this house, not in this room, not in this skin, not in this world. And if that's true, the only question left is, whose world is this? Well, I want to thank the Tape Library and Mystery Archives for joining me in this episode. Do check out their channels, I've linked them below. But I especially want to thank the viewers and their families for sharing their true experiences with me. I know that wasn't always easy. And if you have a true story that you'd like to share, and I mean true, this is not a horror fiction channel, then please check the description for how you can submit a case for consideration. But for now, I'm Peter Laws, and you've been watching Into the Fog. Good night.